Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Istanbul University İlahiyat's program of international talks. Today, I personally can say I'm quite excited as an Ottoman historian. It's very rare that I get to do Ottoman related things these days, especially something which is related to the subject of Britain, which is where I am also from. So one quick thing that I'm going to do before I introduce our co-hosts and guests is that if you guys have any questions, please leave that to the end. The talk, the presentation will be 40 to 45 minutes, and then there'll be a 15 to 20 minute Q&A session. So if you do have a question, leave that to the end. Please just raise your hand. If you are not comfortable raising your hand and speaking, just feel comfortable to put it into the chat box and we will read it from there. Okay, so our guests. So I'd like to say thank you very much to our guests for joining us today and giving us the opportunity to be able to engage in their work. For me, as a late Ottoman historian in particular, I've always had an interest in late Ottoman history, and then of course Islam, which is my subject area. But in particular, once again, I have been a person who's also interacted with the works of Abdullah Quilliam. So this was really exciting for me in terms of having both guests on board. First of all, I want to thank Münire Maksudoğlu, who is a doctoral researcher at the University of Sussex, where she also teaches. Her research is focused on Renaissance drama in conjunction with Anglo-Ottoman diplomacy, on which she writes for memorients.com. She is a co-editor of Islam in Victorian Liverpool. And then Yahya Birt, who is a community historian who has taught at the University of Leeds. He has an MPhil in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Oxford. He has published over a dozen peer-reviewed articles on Islam in Britain and co-edited British Secularism and Religion, Islam, Society and State, which was 2016. He's also a co-writer for Islam in Victorian Liverpool and has written the collected poems of Abdullah Quilliam. So thank you very much for the opportunity of being here. I hope I haven't fudged your introductions in any shape or form. My apologies for that if I've done that. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting us both, and it's a really honor for us to be speaking at the University of Istanbul. And personally, I'm very excited to have a dialogue with you and to hear your reflections and perspectives on what we're going to present. So if I can share my screen, am I able to do that?
You should be able to do that, yes.
Okay. Can everybody see this?
At the moment, yes, we can, yeah.
Okay, all right, so I guess Münire and I will sort of go backwards and forwards in doing this, but I think I'll do the first part and Münire will wrap up the second part. So we thought because the subject of Islam in Britain, in Victorian Britain, might not be that familiar to the audience, we decided that we would provide a little bit of overview and introduction as well before we got into the book itself, the travelogue. So what we're focusing on is looking at Britain's first mosque, which was established in 1887, through a unique perspective, through the eyes of an Ottoman traveler, Yusuf Semih Asmay. And this was published as Islam in Liverpool in 1896. So this is a text that Münire, myself and our colleague Refereedin Ahmed from the University of Bologna worked on. It was one of our COVID lockdown projects. So we have to thank the virus for that. So let me get on to giving you a kind of first a sort of an introduction to Islam in Britain at this time, and also to the first mosque. So, oops, sorry. So the book on the left, this is the book that we were involved with, and so let us go on to discuss the context. So obviously, around about 1900, we aren't really looking so much at a world of nation states, but we're looking at an imperial world. The world is ordered by competitive imperial powers, and the European powers had control of much of the globe by this time. But the two imperial powers that we are talking about today which are relevant to the story of Britain's first mosque are the British Empire, which at this point in time extended around the world. It was held together by maritime networks. And it had also become, by this time, it saw itself as the world's greatest Mohammedan power, in the sense that 100 million Muslims lived within its colonial territories, imperial territories. At the same time, we see the Ottoman domains, and a fair estimate is around about 20 million Muslims living within the Ottoman domains at this time. And so, as we can see, surprisingly, perhaps it's not so surprising that Islam was of concern to the Ottomans. That's no news to anybody in this seminar. But less familiar, perhaps, is that Islam was of great concern to the British Empire at this time too. And there were basically two discourses, one positive, if you like, and one negative. The positive one was this idea that the British were benign rulers of their Muslim subjects, and so these Muslim subjects could enjoy prosperity, free trade, and there was this ideology of free speech, if you like. So they had religious liberties and they had prosperities, and therefore Britain was a good caretaker of its 100 million Muslim subjects, the bulk of whom were in British India. On the other hand, there was a critique of what was called pan-Islamism. This was seen by the British as a subversive anti-imperial force, and something that was to be combated in British India and elsewhere. And at this moment in time, around about 1900, of course, the Ottomans were thinking of, Ittihadi Islam, Islamic unity, as a way of knitting together the Muslim subjects of the Ottoman domains. And so these sorts of discourses around Islamic unity and pan-Islamism and the British Empire as the greatest Mohammedan power, these sorts of discourses were around and available to the fledgling community that was emerging in Britain at this time. So let me say more about that community. So there were probably about less than 10,000 Muslims in Britain at this time, around. Anyway, so I'm going to, if you want to write it in the chat. But basically, the most Muslims who came to Britain at this time, they were often sojourners. They were often working class people. So one group that came were attached to British colonial families, and they worked as personal domestic servants or as ayahs. And ayah was the term used to describe child carers or nannies. And here we see a picture on the left here of two Indian Muslim women looking after two young British boys of the family. Alternatively, it could be very abusive relationships, and these women could be left, could be kicked out due to some kind of dispute over employment and just dumped on the streets of London. Some Christian philanthropists actually set up a home for them in London to look after those who'd been made homeless. Another group who came to Britain at this time, and it's a long history going back a number of centuries, but these were the Lascars. And the Lascars in British, in English, was used as a kind of composite term to talk about non-European sailors employed in the British merchant fleet. And this was a multicultural, multi-dimensional umbrella term. So it included anybody who was picked up along the maritime routes, British maritime routes that went out to the east. So it included through the Suez Canal. So it included, you know, Maltese, Somalilanders, Egyptians, Yemenis, Bengalis, Gujaratis, and so on and so forth. And so it was a wide variety of peoples men who got picked up into the profession of working on the merchant fleets. They often had the difficult and dirty jobs. So with the advent of steam, you had to stoke the engines. This was a difficult work. They would spend the majority, almost all their time below decks. And they had insecure contracts, so quite often these men would be dumped again in London or Liverpool, various docks, and they went on to form the nucleuses of the first Muslim communities in Britain. So among the first Muslim communities, these were all port cities or port towns, and this is where we find the earliest communities, and the core of those communities were these sailors. And so this reserve of Muslim men, not entirely all Muslim men, but mostly Muslim men who were employed in the merchant fleet, expanded greatly with the opening of the Suez Canal in the 1860s. And by 1914, it had become a huge group. So something like over 15% of all sailors in the British merchant fleet were Lascars. So this totaled something over 50,000 men. Now, I have to stress that they weren't permanently resident. They were coming backwards and forwards to Britain through these maritime routes, would spend some time in Britain and would go back to work on the maritime routes. But that said, through the early 20th century, we find that settled communities begin to emerge. So we've had nannies, servants, sailors, and now we have soldiers. So there was a huge army recruited by the British in the First World War from British India. And of this huge army of 1.5 million, it was a mixture of conscription and volunteerism. 400,000 of those were Muslim. And they were deployed right into the Western Front, not just in the East, but also in the Western Front, in all the hottest battle spots of the First World War. When they were injured, they were sent out off the Western Front to Brighton in the summer palace built by the British royal family. The Brighton Pavilions. At the time, it was renamed the Dome Hospital, and they were treated there, and the burial grounds were set up for them at the London Necropolis in Surrey, where some of the earliest Muslim graves in Britain exist until today. Here we see them on the left, praying Eid al-Fitr at the first purpose-built mosque in Britain, the Shah Jahan Mosque in Woking. So beyond these large working class communities that were coming in and out of Britain, it's also important to talk about notables, early Muslim notables and students in Britain. So there are many I could have picked, but here's a selection of 4 to give you a flavor of the idea of the kinds of people who were coming to England at this time. So on the far left, we have Refereedin Ahmed. He was a lawyer. He studied the law for the law in London. He was involved in helping to run the first Islamic association in Britain, the Anjumani Islam of London. He became involved with Victoria's court through the offices of Queen Victoria's Urdu teacher, Munshi Abdul Karim. He arranged, Victoria asked for him to represent her at the Ottoman court, where he visited in 1893. The court, he had his critics in Victoria's court. They were highly critical of him and called him a kind of dangerous pan-Islamist. However, he was really more of an empire loyalist and went on to have a distinguished legal career in British India, and he was knighted subsequently. And he was involved with the first mosque in Britain and Liverpool, where he served as vice president for a number of years, the Liverpool Mosque. The second figure, the young man in the engraving, is the Crown Prince of Afghanistan, Nasrullah Khan. He was sent by his father on a state visit in 1895, and his first port of call was to call in at the Liverpool Mosque, which we'll be talking about later, and is actually featured heavily in our Asmay's account. So he came on a state visit. The idea was to cement relations between Britain and its protectorate in Afghanistan. Then we have Muhammad Ali Jinnah, again in lawyer's clothing, just before he qualified to study for the law, I believe. He was known best as the founder of Pakistan. And then on the far right, we have Dus Muhammad Ali, who set the first anti-imperial black political journal in Britain. This is in London during the First World War. And his journal, the African and Orient Review, he described it as a clearinghouse for African and Asian grievances against the British Empire. He was on the watch list of Scotland Yard, that is the British police force positioned in London. And in fact, that's how I know a lot about his life, because they meticulously tracked his movements. Again, he was involved in the Muslim community in London and knew all the notables there, but he had a wider circle and was in contact with other kind of anti-imperial forces that were coalescing in the capital at the time. So this period, around about 1900, this is where we start to see the emergence of organized Muslim community life. And so there were three mosques. Obviously, the Liverpool Mosque, we see on the left an interior shot, established in 1887, but this is in new premises that were occupied from 1889. Then on the far right, we have, as I mentioned earlier, the first purpose-built mosque, the Shah Jahan Mosque in Woking, originally a private foundation meant to serve students at an Oriental college. It only later served as a mosque in 1913, once it became open to the public. And in the middle, we have a sort of what was known as the London Temporary Mosque that was open between 1895 and 1899. And served students, Muslim students and the like, who came to study in the UK. And it was on the Euston Road in its second location. So let's talk about the founder, briefly introduce the founder of Britain's first mosque community. His name was William Henry Quilliam. He was born in 1856 and died in 1932. He had a double career as a lawyer and as a journalist. He grew up in a nonconformist Protestant background. This is the Wesleyan Church, so that means a non-established church in the English context. So there's an official established church, the Anglican Church. All other Protestant churches are seen as non-established. I guess unofficial churches, if you like. So he was part of that kind of unofficial, often politically more radical and dissenting tradition of Protestant Christianity in Britain. And he was part of something called the Good Templar movement. So the Good Templar movement was a campaign conducted in the 19th century against alcoholism in Britain. As Britain industrialized, serious alcoholism was a big feature of working class urban life. And so these Protestant reformers sought to get working men and women to take a pledge to leave behind all alcohol, and they promoted alternatives like tea and coffee and so on. So Quilliam came from a noted temperance family on both sides. His mother's, his grandfathers, and his maternal and paternal grandparents were part of this movement, and he grew up in the movement, and so never drank alcohol. He took the pledge at the age of 6. A restless soul, through overwork, he traveled to Morocco in 1883. This is the first time he meets Muslims. They introduce him to the topic of Islam. He says he will go home and study, which he does. And then in 1886, he privately embraces Islam. What marks him out as a historic figure as far as Islam in Britain is concerned is that he decides the following year that he's going to preach Islam and to try to establish Islam among his fellow British, English and British sort of compatriots. So to that end, he establishes the Liverpool Muslim Institute in 1887 in rented premises. And over a period of about 15 years, about 250 people embrace Islam at his hands, and he establishes a working mosque. So if I now hand over to, let me say, I've got one more slide, sorry, Münire. So let me say a little bit about this community and what it was like. So there are very few pictures of this community, but these are among the two that survive. So on the left, we have a picture from around about 1894 or thereabouts. This is a picture of Abdullah Quilliam is in the center. He's surrounded by 6 of his children. And we think, and we can't 100% confirm this, but 2 of his wives, he practiced polygamy. And then around him, you have his mother and stepfather seated below him. And you have the Indian Imam who was employed at the time, Mawlana Barakatullah, more about him later, and other converts to, and some of the converts and some of the, I think on the left, some of the Indian students who came were part of the community. On the right, we see another group who supported the Liverpool Mosque. And they were Ottoman subjects. As we can see, they're holding up the Ottoman flags and wearing the fezzes. And in the middle is Ali Mokaish sitting next to Quilliam in the center, and he was the Ottoman consul to Manchester, trade consul. And so Ottoman citizens would come and join the Liverpool Muslim community. It would celebrate the Sultan's birthday, as well as the 2 Eids and so on. And they also described Christmas as the Eid of Hazrat Jesus, alayhi salam. So they celebrated 3 Eids at the mosque. And so these Ottoman citizens who came, not all would be Muslim, some of course would be Christian. But these were traders, often Syrian cotton traders who came to Liverpool to trade in the cotton that was exporting it back to the Middle East, which was being produced in Manchester at the time. So we can see a cosmopolitan community comprised of converts and then of the Muslim people who came to work or to travel in and out of this the great port of Liverpool. So let me hand over to Münire now to the second half of this presentation.
Sorry, Münire, you're on mute. Thank you.
Is that okay now?
That's fantastic. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Istanbul University, for this opportunity to present our joint book project with Yahya. And thanks for his great introduction about and overview of the Muslim community in the British Isles. I would like to give a brief summary of the story of this book, because someone once told me that books have their fates like human beings as well. So the fate of this book has been a very interesting story. I have joined this WhatsApp group, actually. That's how it all started. And the group was kind of community of people who are dreaming and hoping to open the first Muslim history museum in England. So during the discussions, the friend we have over from France, Riordan, came up with this book, and he was interested in knowing what was inside and how the first Muslim community, mosque Muslim community in England was presented by a native Muslim, an Ottoman scholar, a small-time scholar, albeit. So I volunteered to translate it, and Yahya, kindly offered to join the team to edit and make it more full-fledged research in the public offices and so on, because we had to track down certain information provided in the book, which you will find scandalizing, at best, and maybe, outrageous at worst. I would definitely, recommend you to have a look and, enjoy the ride of Yusuf Semih Asmay in his journey to Liverpool in the last decade of the 19th century. So this is how the book came about, and we are very happy that now people of all, research areas can have a look and, enjoy reading it, because it's a fun read. It is definitely not boring at all. I can, vouch for that. So this is the story of the book, apart from the story inside the book. So can we move on to the next slide? Yeah. So who is Yusuf Semih Asmay? We have talked about Abdullah Quilliam, who is the, let's say, the antagonist or the protagonist of this travelogue, but the author himself is a very colorful figure as well, in my humble opinion. Turkish readers, Turkish audience may find him, his name might sound familiar to you guys, because I think he was kind of popular for a very short period of time during the discussions about the language revolution, the alphabet reform that we had in last year or a couple of years before, I think. He has a book on the language reform, Yazımız, and it was published by a few publishing houses relatively recently. So you may find his name familiar from that book if you came across it, Yazımız. But this one was written much earlier, of course. It was written in late 1895 in installments after his return from his journey to England. He has started writing it down during his stay there, and then compiled everything into a book form after he returned to Cairo. But Yusuf Semih Asmay's birth date is a bit, ambiguous, as it is with many late Ottoman scholars. He was born in southern part of Turkey, in Adana, and he was a Turkish language instructor after he completed his studies in Istanbul in Köprülüoğlu Medrese. So he comes from, a solid educational background, if you can call it that way. After he is appointed as a Turkish language instructor to Egypt, he settles down there basically and doesn't return to Turkey, considering the later developments in the country. So I would say he's a self-imposed exile after the revolution. But we are talking about his journeys before that period, before pro-republican period of his career. And during his life in Egypt, he is more or less a nationalistic figure, if you may say so, because he's first and foremost an Ottoman. So he's advocating Turkish rights and Turkish press, and he's working to make sure that Turkish media presence can, fight back other multinational, well, I would say non-Muslim media powers in Egypt. So he's a kind of nationalistic figure. And this is not his first journey to England, actually. So this is about his third journey to England. And after his first two journeys, he's a good traveler, and he can speak a couple of languages. So, he's comfortable, traveling up and down Europe. So his friends suggest that he would, visit Liverpool, since he's been going to England, a couple of times before. So that's what kind of pushes him to make this visit. And, it's like a pre-planned project in his mind. It's not a, random thing that he, come upon and, makes his mind on the spot. He's like, before he travels, he knows that he's going to Liverpool and he's going to visit this community, and he's going to observe their practices and see if they can live up to their public image. And what we are talking about, why we are talking about a public image, because the publications of the Liverpool Muslim community, that is Crescent, which is a newspaper or weekly paper that is distributed, interestingly, very widely in the Islamic world, including Egypt and other Ottoman territories, gives the Muslims in Egypt a certain image of this community. They feel like, like the banner of Islam is rising from the West, maybe that's going to be the salvation of the Ummah, and so on and so forth. It's like quite idealistic and a bit, sugar-coated way of putting things. So he wants to see with his own eyes, if this is true, or, how true it is. And so, can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah. But, of course, like in every similar story, public image never lives up to the real expectations of the people, right? Like we see people on the news, on the media, in the papers, on the book. It's never going to match the reality, 100%. It's impossible. But this is more than 100% or not, mismatching story. The community of Muslims in Liverpool, among them Nafisa Keep, befriends Asmay, and they have discussions, and they have agreements. They happen to agree more with each other than they do with Quilliam. So they become a kind of allies, and she explains and kind of exposes to Asmay more than he would possibly know and learn by himself. So Nafisa Keep is an American convert to Islam, and she's a journalist, and she's also like the copy editor of the Crescent, the paper that Liverpool Muslim Institute is publishing. So she is a person inside the institution, inside the community, and like she has a position, and she's been there for a while. And but she's very critical of the community because of their practices, and because of their Islamic practices. She's more orthodox in terms of rituals and so on. And so she, with Asmay's help, even writes to Abdul Hamid about the unorthodox practices of the community. So it's a kind of like a very magazine-like story, if you may, like lots of gossip, and lots of scandalous allegations and so on. And later on in the book, you will see that she'll be expelled out of the community. So she will leave England and she will go to Egypt and so on. Like it goes on like a movie, actually. You know, there are lots of action going on. It's not a, you know, boring, dull intellectual discussions or something like that. It's very action-packed, if you may say so. So that's how Asmay knows too much about Liverpool Muslim community and the Institute and the workings of the Institute through Nafisa. So I wouldn't say she's the bug, but like she discloses lots of things to him, and he discloses them in the book as well. Of course, with the best of intentions, because he thinks this is his duty, and he, you know, over and over in the book reiterates that, you know, this is not about, you know, exposing people. This is not about gossip or, you know, slander and so on and so forth. This is like in order to make sure that Muslim community knows what is going on there, and so that they would make the best of judgment about this group of converts, and so that they wouldn't have, you know, those dreams about expansion of Islam in England and, you know, a total salvation kind of utopic idea. And the next is going to be about Mawlana Barakatullah. This is another important figure in the community, but he's not, how I would put it, he's ally. I think he has allied with Asmay at some point, but he is also a very close confidant, maybe, and assistant of Quilliam. So like this guy is like an in-between figure, like he's playing towards the both sides of the this critical and kind of interesting relationship. So he's in good terms with Quilliam. He's in good terms with Asmay as well. Although Asmay kind of dismisses him in his book, and, you know, his character, and in terms of his Islamic educational background, he is also very critical of this figure. But we understand that they were in correspondence, and Barakatullah has disclosed information, some financial information, which would, you know, put Quilliam in a very bad spot to Asmay during his correspondence, although like he remains anonymous. But this is our conclusion with Yahya and Riordan. This is what, you know, we have come to understand. And so Barakatullah remains in the Institute in LMI for a number of years after Asmay left. So he's not expelled or anything, or like Nafisa keeps, so he remains there. He's loyal to Quilliam compared to Mrs. Keep. And we don't hear about him after he left LMI, so or not, we don't know what have become of him. But he's an important figure, and maybe, you know, it's important to look into him and, you know, what he has been up to after that. And so this is the end of the, I think, our presentation. And if there are any questions, please leave in the comment section. And thank you for having us. And I would leave the floor to Yahya for final comments, maybe.
Okay, thank you, Münire. So I'll just quickly wrap up with maybe the last couple of slides, if that's okay, Dr. Yaqub. Is that okay?
That's fantastic. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So what was the substance of Asmay's criticism? I mean, you know, like a lot of early travelogues to Ottoman travelogues to Europe and other Muslim travelers who came from, say, from India or Persia, quite often we're looking at the kind of the return of the Western gaze and an Eastern gaze upon the West, and so that is the main dynamic. in these travelogues. But in this particular travel, and Asmay wrote travelogues like that. He'd written an earlier one to England, the south of England, which was published in 1892. So this was his second book about England. But what marks this out, of course, is that it's a different kind of dynamic. It's about the debates within the Muslim Ummah at that time about religious reform, the direction of Islam politically, and so on, and the fortunes of Muslims. And so a lot of it is very resonant for today's world. So Asmay comes as a skeptic. He's heard about this community. It's, as Münire said, it's reported daily in the Cairo press and the press in Delhi and in Istanbul, because of the great publicity that Quilliam had produced through his own publications about the community. And so one of the main questions is a political question about Muslim unity, and how do you make Muslim unity happen in a period of European domination, and who is best fit to lead it, and how best ought it to be sort of prosecuted, if you like, from the margins, let's say within the British Empire. How could Muslims cement Islamic unity? And so, as I mentioned in the first slide earlier, we lived in an imperial age, and there were these different discourses, Ottoman and British, about Islamic unity, and who would be best fit to promote it. And this is where Quilliam is an interesting figure, intriguing figure, because of his position in Liverpool, he develops what we could call a sort of hybrid doctrine of dual loyalty to crown and caliph. So the crown, the British crown, was the temporal authority that he acknowledged, but he acknowledged the overall spiritual authority of the caliph. His methodology was to promote this sort of dual loyalty model using English language as a medium. And of course, now that English has become a global Muslim language too, not just a language of global business, a lot of Muslim intellectuals now write and exchange ideas in the medium of English. But in the late 19th century, this was a very novel thing. And the great Islamic 8 languages were Turkish and Arabic and Persian and Urdu and so on. So for Quilliam to be using English and to be promoting Islamic unity in English was novel, was new. And then he obviously saw the importance of using the steam ships of empire to carry this magazine, and using obviously the medium of print technology, which was a cutting edge technology at the time, through these maritime links to send the Crescent newspaper through all the ports of empire. And that's why it had such a wide distribution from Liverpool. One scholar estimates it had a wider distribution than, for instance, Muhammad Abduh and Rashid Rida's Al-Manar, the lighthouse. It had a wider distribution than this very influential Arabic language reform journal. And Quilliam's also saw a political role for himself. So he took up the title Sheikh al-Islam of the British Empire. And it's clear that he saw this as a mediating role between the 100 million Muslim subjects of the British Empire and the Caliph. And wanted to sort of, if you like, represent the interests of these Muslim subjects to the Caliph, but also represent the Caliph to those Muslim subjects of the British Empire. And so Asmay is a critic of this novel form of pan-Islamism that Quilliam promoted, and said that actually loyalty should be to the Caliph. The medium of the center is not Liverpool, but Istanbul. And the medium of that shouldn't be English. It has to be in Arabic, which is the language of the Muslims. And he obviously questioned Quilliam's qualifications to take such a big role of representation between the British subjects of the British Empire, the Muslim subjects of the British Empire, and the Ottoman Caliphate. He saw that as presumptuous. And so that was the core of their political argument about how Islamic unity could be propagated from the margins of Ummah, from within the domains of the British Empire. There are other criticisms that Münire has highlighted around his leadership to do with use of finances, that the Crescent had a lot of propaganda elements in it that weren't really very true, and also about his personal character and misconduct. But we won't sort of dwell on that because maybe that's less academically interesting. But certainly, as Münire says, it's very engaging and a highly entertaining text. So the final thing I just want to touch on is that the other sort of element of his criticism, besides his political differences with Quilliam, was about what he saw as unorthodox practices at the mosque. So here we see one of the few images that we have on the left of the inside of the mosque. And here we see there's a stage beneath a sort of archway with a star and crescent, Ottoman star and crescent. We see a kind of a raised table, a raised platform with the table and chairs. There's an organ on the right-hand side. It's not here, but it's in one of the other pictures. And here we see rows of chairs. And so what Asmay describes in one of the chapters of the book is what were described as Sunday divine services held at 7 o'clock on a Sunday. In what was known, at least until 1894, the mosque was known, also went by the name of the Church of Islam. And so Quilliam and his community had a problem because they had two very different audiences and sets of expectations to work with. So on this very busy road where the mosque was, the West Derby Road, a lot of working people came up and down that road day and night. They had the mosque suffered a lot of hostility. So there could be stones thrown, windows broken, people would come in and break up the services, and this was reported in the local press. The police got involved, so there was hostility, particularly in the early years. On the other hand, because of the global fame of this mosque, the mosque was started after 1890, started to receive a lot of visitors. And so you had the bemused Muslim visitor who would come and see a sort of hybrid Anglo-Christian Islamic service. And so they couldn't really make sense of it. There would be singing of Christian style hymns, but Quilliam would change the lyrics of those hymns so they only reflected Islamic monotheism. Then there'd be a sermon, and the sermon would vehemently attack Christianity. But both Christian and Muslim visitors coming to and witnessing this service saw it as a kind of very Christian in form, at least, if not in content. So, but this was, let us say, this was a community of converts who, when Quilliam embraces Islam in the 1880s, they were largely self-taught from Orientalist sources. It's amazing how much Quilliam could sort of understand of the religion, even from these sources. But let's say this was a community on a journey from autodidacticism towards a sort of growing orthodoxy. So by 1906, they issue a prayer manual for ablutions and prayer, which is sort of Hanafi, essentially Hanafi. But in the mid 1890s, when Asmay visits, certainly they're still on a journey towards that. And so he's critical about the lack of Islamic knowledge. He criticizes Mawlana Barakatullah for not having imparted Islamic learning adequately to this community. And so, he sort of says, you should be doing your job properly. And he blames Quilliam as leader of that community for not focusing more on Islamic knowledge and learning. Here we see a picture of the collection of hymns that were sung on Sunday evenings at the mosque. And here we see Quilliam has put the Surah Al-Fatiha into kind of a poetic verse form. And this was sung at these services on Sundays. So I'm just leaving that for here, but that would be sung in a kind of manner of an Anglican or non-conformist hymn. So that ends our presentation, and we'd be happy to open for questions.
Thank you very much, Yahya and Münire. I really appreciate that. That was really informative, especially for someone like me. There's so many questions I have. So before I open the floor, I have just two very quick questions. One is a technical one, and one is just speculative. The speculative question is, near the end, I see a lot of the way, the symbology of the Ottoman state and Islam, and a sort of identity of being British and Christianity and so forth, it reminds me of the similarities of the Nation of Islam in some ways, in terms of the emergence of the nation. In the beginning, they use a lot of Ottoman symbols. The moon and the crescent is something which is similar. They use the flag of the Young Turks, and you start to see in that formative period during the nation that they're trying to find their steps. And Dr. Sherman Jackson's, he makes it very clear that for a lot of Black American Muslims, the nation is sort of like a pathway to moving towards Orthodox Sunnism to some degree. And so there is a sense of appreciation by the Black Muslim community in America in particular regarding the Nation of Islam, something that mainstream Muslims in other parts of the world don't have. So that's the first thing. Do you see any similarities there? The technical question I'm asking is, to what degree did you guys as academics try to scrutinize and verify Yusuf Asmay's ideas on Abdullah Quilliam? For example, I'm reading works of a Chinese traveler who came to Istanbul, and he has a lot of these tropes that he thinks regarding the Ottomans, but I've been scrutinizing his own impressions of Istanbul, recognizing that he too has been influenced in some shape or form, and sometimes the information he has regarding hearsay, gossip, and his interlocutors are not always true. So did you do anything in regards to scrutinize whether his stories hold up in regards to Abdullah Quilliam? Thank you.
Shall I take the general question, and Münire, you can take the technical one? So with regard to the analogy with the Nation of Islam and African American Muslims, I think that's very appropriate. There is a shared use of Ottoman, late Ottoman and young Turkish symbols, but we can say in the case of Quilliam that it's not just symbolic usage that is there. So he has a very real relationship with the Hamidian court that stretches between 1890 all the way up to probably 1905, 1906 at least. In fact, I noticed Dr. Matthew Sharp is among our audience today. He's done a thesis looking at the Ottoman archives with respect to Abdullah Quilliam and Alexander Russell Webb, another prominent convert in New York. But basically, Quilliam and his son, who later became an Ottoman officials, they had long-standing relationship with local Ottoman officials in Liverpool and Manchester, as well as visited Istanbul several times. And Quilliam had probably at least three audiences, I think, with Abdul Hamid personally, at least three, and represented him in a number of two missions, as far as we know. So there was a real relationship there, and there was some patronage in terms of financial aid, at least that's claimed by the Crescent, in some of the projects of the Liverpool Muslims. So, and some gifts and so on, and honors were given to him and to his family members. So there was a relationship there. In fact, this book, Asmay's book, was banned by the Ottomans in 1898 by a decree from the Ministry of the Interior. No reason is given other than that it should be banned, and books could be banned for many reasons, but the most likely reason is that it coincides with a visit of Quilliam's 30 days earlier, where he has an audience. He claimed he had an audience with the Sultan Abdul Hamid himself. So I think that despite the fact that the local Ottoman officials sided with Asmay's criticisms of the lack of orthodox practice and so on at the Liverpool Muslim Institute, the Ottoman civilized states appears to have taken a view, namely that it was value of this community was greater than its deficits. Let's put it that way, from their point of view. They were taking a global view, maybe. The local officials were taking a kind of grassroots view. But so the differences are very interesting, and they're captured in our book. Anyway, I will pass on to Münire to answer your other question.
Regarding your question about how we scrutinized Asmay's observations and sometimes allegations, since they are very scandalous, even when we look from 2022. Of course, we were especially Yahya went into the public records office and, to verify certain claims that he makes in Asmay makes in his book. Also, we have cross-referenced, other reports about the community, although because they are coming from non-Muslim authors, it was a bit hard, how to take them as a reliable reference. But in most cases, they match, especially in terms of, the practices, for prayers, for daily prayers, and also the description of the interiors of the mosque. So that's how we worked, rather than taking Asmay's observations and claims at face value. We try to verify them through other accounts, both official accounts and both personal literary works that we have done. And also, I don't want to, I don't want it to sound like a negative description of Asmay's loyalties, or his view, his worldview, intellectual view of the community, because even though he's quite harsh and very critical at certain areas, he is at the end of the day trying to be as inclusive as possible, regardless of what he has seen, what he has heard, and conversed with the community, because he's making a point to use an Islamic language when describing this community. For instance, you have seen the picture of the, not the picture, but at least a drawing of the interior of the mosque, which looks very church-like, if you may say so. But Asmay uses terminology of the mosque architecture in order to describe that. I think that's a very, sincere effort to include them in the Muslim imagination. These people are Muslim at the end of the day, no matter they disregard daily prayer times, or no matter how they sing the surahs and so on. Yeah, this is a Muslim community. So he's trying to describe them with the lexicon, with the terminology of a Muslim culture, of a mosque architecture, and so on and so forth. Although he bashes the mosque as a kind of, this is like a salon, a musical kind of theatrical place, but he's trying to still describe the place as a mosque. He uses mahfil and minbar and those kind of terminology, which actually doesn't match, but still he wants his audience to reimagine this place as a mosque and these people as a jama'ah, no matter what kind of bid'ahs that they come up with, and so on and so forth, which I found a kind of a very nice gesture, in my opinion. And he always tries to make sure that these people are not. This is a problem that I had felt that was lost in translation, because we call those people who accept Muslim faith muhtadis, which means literally the guided ones, or those who found the right path. But when you translate it to English, it's always convert, which doesn't have very metaphysical, spiritual connotations. The convert, the first thing that comes to your mind is money, all those, currency rates and so on and so forth, because of conversion, right? Which doesn't really give a very positive and spiritual experience to the reader. But, I try to include it in the brackets and so on, like he doesn't say convert, he says muhtadi, which is guided ones. So when you say these are the guided ones, it brings a different layer, it opens a different layer of understanding. These were the guided ones. These people were guided to the faith, and maybe they were not guided, or they were not instructed by the best of the instructors, or there's some absence of Islamic background, education, lack of solid, solid fiqh and so on and so forth. But still, these are the guided ones. So I found this was a bit, lost in translation from Turkish to English, but at least, Asmay, you put it that way, which is important since this book is at the end of the day is about faith. That's the crux of the matter, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, actually, I find that really fascinating. The idea, I think Yahya and I have had these conversations before about language and the way that we use language and the way that the Islamic 8 languages work in terms of how Islam is infused in the Islamic 8 languages, and that sometimes English, which hasn't embraced the Islamic 8 in the same way, doesn't still have the same sort of vocabulary that can explain particular phenomena. And in your personal opinions, just both of you, before I open the floor, how do you feel about the way, I mean, I got that sense, Münire, that you were far more, you feel quite positive in the way that Asmay has used this type of terminology to explain this phenomena. Do you think there is a need in English then to try to use something similar to what Asmay has proposed to some degree in the Ottoman Turkish or in the Arabic, as a way of describing people who become newly Muslim in their adulthood over people who were probably born in Muslim families?
Yeah, I think I have observed in various communities the need to come up with a new terminology. Recently, people use revert instead of convert, which still doesn't hold the spiritual or metaphysical connotations of the guided one, muhtadi, that we use in Islamic language. But at least there is an effort which is produced because of the need to avoid this word convert, which comes with its negative connotations, because of course changing from one Christian faith to Muslim faith is never considered as a positive action. But for us, it's about just the return of the person who was born into the Muslim faith anyway. At least that's how we doctrinally believe. So there is a need, but I don't know how long it will take for us to produce that language, because language doesn't come in a couple of years or decades. It takes sometimes centuries. But I think I can observe a move towards that direction. But maybe we have to push the boundaries of English in that sense, which doesn't come across as a very spiritual one or spiritually inclined one as a non-native. That's my impression. But I hope we can create that language, and there is a need to create that language. Because then some aspects of the text is lacking in English. And I'm not advocating that, like we should only use Arabic or Turkish or Persian, Islamic language when we are producing works in these subjects. But still, we have some way to go, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so what we're going to do then is we're going to open up the floor. So if you do have any questions, please just simply raise your hand so that I can see it, or feel comfortable to write it in the chat. If not, I have a list of questions still, so I can go on, so it's not a problem for me. Okay, I have another question then. When you put out the hymns, Yahya, or the Fatiha that was written in the style of a hymn, what came to my mind was when Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad was doing a dhikr in a particular style, which was considered as a Christian hymn. And what I found interesting was that in most Muslim countries, when they saw that, they didn't know what to make of it, because it was something which was quite different from them in accordance to how they perceive Christianity and how they perceive Islam. And here an attempt was being done that is perceived as being quite indigenous. We see the same thing with Ali Kila in terms of some of his music, in terms of how he's trying to create a particular fusion. And that was what was coming to my mind when I was seeing what you put up there regarding Abdullah Quilliam. I was wondering if you can just explain a little bit more about this sort of like this text and how it works and how it operates and how it would have been understood by the various communities in some shape or form.
So just so I'm clear, are you talking about reception today of that kind of material, or are you talking
no at the time? Yeah, at the time. I'm just giving today's reception an example, because even today there is a particular type of reception that sort of fusion is taken, but this is like 100 years ago. So you know.
Well, I mean, obviously we have I mean, as Münire was saying earlier, you know, Asmay is actually quite open to this, the hymns, because he sees it as it's not replacing salah or namaz as such. It's a kind of synthetic act of worship. When challenged, the Liverpool Muslim community sort of defends this by saying it's a form of dawah, and they use the term dawah. They say this is a kind of form of culturally sensitive outreach that passers-by, people coming into the Church of Islam, will recognize as worship, through which we can send Islamic messages. I think the thing that marks it out as being more than dawah is the fact that it's also ibadah in some sense, because it's always recognized by Christians who come in, even hostile missionaries, as well as people who were curious about the Church of Islam, as well as Muslim visitors, as looking like an act of worship. So it was ambiguous, you know, maybe it was dawah, maybe it was also somehow worship as well. And so because Asmay reserves his criticisms for not fixing the prayer times of the namaz, so as the sun moves throughout the year, the time of Isha, you know, the times was fixed at, so, you know, at a particular time. So because that wasn't moving, you know, it would confuse people, Orthodox Muslims who would come in. You know, the wrong number of rakats would be prayed at the wrong time and that kind of thing. So it would be confusing for people. And that was a subject. Asmay doesn't hold back on that. John J. Poole, another missionary who comes, he remarks that the hymns seem very unremarkable. References could be heard in the kind of sermons being preached could be heard in any church. Unitarian church is that branch of Christianity who believes that, you know, God is one and there cannot be three. And he's actually not exercised by it. Another missionary, Martin, who comes in, Dr. Martin, I forgot his second name now, who comes in and gives an account. Again, he's more hostile to it. So I think there are a range of reactions to the hymn singing, but clearly, you know, Britain back then was a much more, there's a kind of the Christian revival of 19th century England, when England was urbanizing, and a lot of you know, British people came from the countryside. Building churches was a major part of urbanization, and new Christian churches arose and became prominent in the 19th century, including the Methodists and the Wesleyans that Quilliam came out of. So this was something that was, you know, you have to look at, as I said, he was self-taught, and he taught himself Islam, and I think he reached for what he knew, what he grew up with. So for him to bring all these things together wasn't strange or odd or hybrid. It was just bringing together what he knew. To us, it looks strange and odd and hybrid because we're not used to it. But to him, it was, I think, bringing together what he knew into a synthesis. So, I mean, I don't think we know enough about how the congregation viewed it, but it was a practice that was never given up. So I think as far as we know, it continued until 1908. But the namaz or the salah was more rigorously practiced in an orthodox form as time went on. But this service was never left by the community.
Fantastic. Okay, I have one last question before we end. Oh, there is a hand raised. Let's have a see where. Whose hand is raised? I can't see it.
There's a question in the chat as well by David Hellman.
Yeah, okay, let's have a look at the chat. 1 second. I can't see the question in the chat. Yeah. Do you mind just reading it out? Is that okay?
David says, could one not argue that all Muslim cultures have to integrate musical modalities and instruments to make them, quotes, Islamicate? Qawwali comes to mind, where the instruments may predate Islam, but the modes were adapted later by the Mughals. In that light, could we see the hymns by Quilliam as a stage in adaptation? I would simply agree and say yes. That's obvious. We see the adoption of different musical modalities throughout the Islamicate, and why that wouldn't include Britain. I don't see why that wouldn't include Britain.
Okay, all right, and this is my last question and then we'll end. So one of the things I found interesting was not only in terms of the sympathy to some degree, or shall I say empathy, that Asmay showed towards Quilliam in regards to him having his clear understandings of what Islam is, but still willing to negotiate with what he was witnessing in terms of this new community. But upon Abdullah Quilliam's journey to Istanbul, it seems like even Abdul Hamid II was willing to show a level of the same sort of leniency, shall I say, understanding the situation. And although one may assume that the book may have been banned because of political reasons, it's very possible that Abdul Hamid actually, on a more empathetic level, chose to ban the book because he wanted the community to have its space and so forth, which I found intriguing. But what I wanted to know, in addition to that, is there any evidence that you saw that upon Quilliam's arrival to Istanbul, that he was introduced to ulama who would then educate him, because there's an assumption that you mentioned that he was self-educated as a way of trying to help the community back in England?
Do you want to take this, Münire, or shall I?
Well, as far as we know, there is no such, formal introduction in the way of educating him or kind of like, helping him to improve in terms of his Islamic, background, educational background. But we know he was introduced to another convert, as far as I know, a Japanese one, if I'm not mistaken. So he was chaperoned, of course, in Istanbul. But I think language was a barrier because most of the, Turkish scholars, Ottoman scholars in Istanbul would be well versed in French at best as a third language. Arabic would be being the second language. So English would not be very widely spoken among the Islamic scholars. That would have put, in my mind, that would have put kind of barrier in terms of, introducing him to Islamic scholars for instructing him or, giving him the tools to step up his game in terms of, Islamic sciences and so on. That's my view of it, but I don't know what Yahya thinks.
I mean, it's kind of a tangential. That's probably right. I mean, I think there's evidence that the what's interesting is the ulama themselves did receive some of his writings quite favorably. So, for instance, Rashid Rida reviewed an Arabic translation of his book, Quilliam's book, The Faith of Islam, and reviewed it favorably. And what's really mysterious, we've not really, I think Dr. Matthew Sharp, who's in the call here in the audience here, is going to work on it. But Akseki, who was an Ottoman scholar, wrote a book, published a book in I think it was 1914 or 1912, called The Complete Answer, and this was also later translated into Arabic as well, and he attributes it to Quilliam, but almost certainly it's his own work, and because it's far too sophisticated to have been written by Quilliam. It's theologically sophisticated work. And so the idea that an Ottoman alim would attribute a work to Quilliam, a kind of pseudo-Quilliam work, is very intriguing to me. And my guess would be that my best guess is that Quilliam became a kind of a metaphor for a certain kind of sort of pro-Islamic civilizational argument. So in the faith of Islam, he makes a case for Islam as a civilization, and that was a new form of apologetics at the time. And the ulama like Rashid Rida and others received that quite well as a different line of argument. So it could be that, Quilliam was associated with, the name became associated with certain kinds of novel ideas in modernist Islamic apologetics or reformist ulama apologetics. But I think that needs more work. Thank
you very much. Okay, on that note, the first thing I want to say is thank you very much to both of our speakers, Münire and Yahya Birt, for your fantastic presentation. I really found it fascinating. And like I said, as an Ottoman historian and somebody from the United Kingdom, a book that sort of tries to bring these two sort of worldviews in an interconnected world together is fascinating. I've put the link of the book in the chat. Please do support our Muslim scholars and scholarship, and also our Muslim publishing houses who are trying to work exceptionally hard as a way of trying to get these independent works out so that we can read them. As many of us know who are academics, it's not very easy to be able to do that at this moment in time. So please do take a look and share it with your friends. Once again, I want to say thank you so much for both of you, both of the speakers. If you ever happen to be in Istanbul, please do pay us a visit so that we can organize some sort of not only a professional interaction, but a more personal one. We would love to have you here now that COVID is coming to an end, so to speak. Thank you very much for everyone for being here today. And inshallah, we'll see you at the next talk, which will be next month. Take care and assalamu alaikum.